We're going to learn a fascinating concept about the difference between mitzvahs that are mandated by the Torah and mitzvahs that were instituted by the Rabbanon. All comes from the Rambam, because nachdem the Rambam rechnet with protius alle mitzvahs, after the Rambam goes through all the details of all the mitzvahs in the Hagdama von Sifrei Yad HaChazaka, in the introduction to his 14 volumes of Jewish law, the Yad HaChazaka, the Mishnah Torah, his Mamshech then continues. These are the 613 mitzvahs that were given to Moshe at Har Sinai. They in their general concepts, the details therein. And then he says, there were other mitzvahs that were innovated after Matan Torah. And they were instituted by the prophets and the sages. And they were then accepted across the Jewish world. Going, for example, Mikra Megillah, reading the Megillah, and Chanukah, lighting Chanukah candles, V'Tainis Tisha B'Av, fasting on Tisha B'Av, V'Eruvin, and an Eruv on Shabbos, the various kinds of Eruvin, V'Yadayim Chule, washing hands. We are required to accept and to fulfill all of these mitzvahs that were instituted by the sages. Because it says it happens to be in our parasha, do not veer from the things that the sages will instruct you. The Rebbe has a fascinating question on this. Needs to be understood. Everything the Rambam writes is absolutely letter perfect. And when the Rambam brings a whole lot of things, usually he summarizes and he details. Like, for example, overall, the whole concept of Mishnah Torah does the same. There's this concept of giving us summaries and giving us lists. He doesn't just go with an introduction. That are intended to separate all the content of this composition into different halachas. Each by topic. And I'll split them into chapters that are on the same subject. And then each chapter I'm going to split them into individual halachas, that they should be easy to recall. No, it doesn't leave it at that. No, he lists them and numbers them. After he tells us all the mitzvahs, then he says, I saw that it would be a good idea to split this into 14 books. So there's already your first list or numbering. And then the Rambam goes, each book, what its name is, what its theme is, and every single book, how many mitzvahs will have. For example, Sefer Hamada, the first he says, there are 5 mitzvahs, 5 halachas that have to be unpacked. And then he goes through the, all the various topics, all the way till Hilchos Tshuva. The same to the number of mitzvahs. Besides the fact that it gives us the overall principle of how many mitzvahs there are. Like he does at the end of his introduction, before he actually lists the mitzvahs. He says, to the mitzvahs that apply across the whole of history are 613 mitzvahs. Out of which 248 are positive mitzvahs. And the rest are negative mitzvahs, 365. So it tells us the numbers. And then the Rambam repeats this information multiple times. And then before each section he tells us how many mitzvahs are in this section, how many are positive mitzvahs, how many are negative mitzvahs. For example, Hilchos Yesod Torah, the first section, which is the fundamentals of Torah, he says, Yesh Bichlal Esem mitzvahs, it contains 10 mitzvahs, Sheish mitzvahs aseh, of which 6 are positive, 5 mitzvahs and 4 are negative. And then he tells us what they are. And then at the end of each book, he recalls again what the mitzvahs were. The mitzvah klali or prati from the mitzvah shaboy. What the general number was and how many were positive and negative. Sefer Hamada. Again, let's use the first book as an example. He concludes by saying, there are 75 mitzvahs in this section, in this book. 16 are positive, and 59 of them are negative mitzvahs. If the Rambam is so precise and numbers are so important and lists are so important, then we have to understand how come here the Rambam does not write the Rambam soll Yad angeben the mitzvah von the mitzvos mit divrei soifrim. How come he doesn't say anything about the rabbinic mitzvahs? Not here and not anywhere in the 14 volumes of Mishnah Torah. Surely that's important. In Sefer HaMitzvos, sagt the Rambam. So the Rambam says in Sefer HaMitzvos, when mitzvos, where he challenges the view of the Balalochas Gdolos, who includes rabbinic mitzvahs on the number of mitzvahs, because the Rambam doesn't. He says, He says, how can you start adding rabbinic mitzvahs? Then the numbers are going to run into the thousands. We have 613 mitzvahs. If you're going to add anything else, who knows where it's going to end? So maybe that's the reason why the Rambam doesn't give the list, because it could run into the thousands. But the truth is that two compelling reasons why that cannot be the reason the Rambam did not give us the number. Well, because Aleph, first of all, Adrab, to the contrary. If there are so many mitzvahs derabanan, you already have to tell us how many there are. Because it helps us to know what they are, helps us to remember them. Numbers, lists, help us remember things. Beyond that. Let's look at what the Rambam said about the 613 mitzvahs. He tells us, he says, the reason I'm listing every single one of them, and in the context of the section I'm about to discuss, is because I don't want to skip anything. If I'm going to list all of the mitzvahs by number, nothing's going to be left out. That logic is so the same logic, and perhaps even more so, applies to mitzvahs derabanan. So we don't miss any of them. You should actually list them. If there's so many, somebody's got to collate the list. But a more important reason why this is not a good enough explanation is the shayla of was itself that they need is wegen the mitzvahs derabanan bichloluson. The question we're asking over here is about the general mitzvahs derabanan. Like the Rambam gives us examples of what he's referring to. He's not getting into the details of all the things that apply to Chanukah, all the things that apply to Megillah. He's talking about the high-level stuff. And not only that, once you get to that high-level stuff, how many are there in Ganzen? Void Veker. The Rambam over here is talking specifically about mitzvahs that were introduced by the Chachamim. Not nitik zeireis v'syogim was sie haben zugegeben und reingegeben in die mitzvahs deraisa. He's not talking over here about any kind of protection that the Chazal made around existing mitzvahs deraisa. He's talking about mitzvahs that they, so to speak, created. Or the minhagos v'chayotz v'zeh. Not talking about minhagim. And there's so mitzvahs mitzvahs is talking about mitzvahs mugbal umut. You know how many things the Chachamim, the Nevi'im enacted in Ganzen. In most places, it's 7 mitzvahs and no more. So why doesn't the Rambam tell us there's 7 mitzvahs derabanan? Let's try another explanation. Perhaps the answer lies in something that the Rambam himself says, which is, the Rambam sagt, the Rambam tells us that whatever the Chachamim instructed us to do, and anything that they warned us not to do, that was all instructed by the Eibishter in the Torah. That we have to do what they say. Where? Because the pasuk says that you have to do as they instruct you. And the Torah also, the Eibishter warned us not to transgress anything that they tell us we may not transgress. How do we know that? Because it says that you may not veer from the things that they tell you. Whereas the Rambam goes into this in a lot of detail in Hilchas Mamrim, which is all about people who rebel against the courts. So now the Ramban is masik of Yedivrei Rambam. The fact that the Rambam says it all belongs to the positive mitzvah of Al Pi HaTorah Asher Yerucha, follow what they tell you, and the negative mitzvah Lo Yisasu, don't veer from what they've told you. So now we know that we have to keep all the mitzvahs derabanan. So the Ramban has a whole lot of questions on this. And Frek Kama V'Chamet Kushya. So B'neihan, we're going to focus on one of his questions. If every single mitzvah derabanan is actually about fulfilling a mitzvah saseh of the Torah, al pi HaTorah she'erucha, and avoiding a mitzvah lo saseh of the Torah, lo sasur. So then the question is, then we should be really, really strict about mitzvahs derabanan. Because every mitzvah derabanan is actually a mitzvah d'oraisa. So ask the Ramban to the Rambam, you're telling me we have to keep the mitzvahs derabanan because the Torah says so. If that's the case, how come we're more lenient in mitzvahs derabanan than we are in mitzvahs d'oraisa? So any from the Terutzim Shabbazein Mefarshim, some Mefarshim suggest one possible answer, which is let's say that a person ignores a mitzvah that the Rabbanan made, so they don't light Hanukkah candles, or a person breaks a law of the Rabbanan, so they eat on Tisha B'Av. So is men that is not what the Rambam means, that you're breaking what the Torah says, that you have to follow the words of the Chachamim, or that you may not veer from their words. Now, blows down when man is nit mekabel the mitzvah or the ne'isud rabbanan, then is nit moiden divrei chachamim. But rather, the Mefarshim want to suggest that the Rambam is saying when it says al pi Torah she'yerucha means you have to accept their authority. When it says lo saser, don't veer from what they've told you, it means you don't rebel against the authority. If an individual transgresses one of their laws, that is not a doraisa. That says in other words, the mitzvah, the positive mitzvah to follow the instructions of the Chachamim, or the lafum loy tosser, and the prohibition against veering from the words of the Chachamim, is nit dem etzem ton or the nit ton das was the Chachamim haben mitaken given, does not mean that this is the measure of whether you're doing exactly what they said or not. No, the mitzvah is lishma b'chol meib kol ben bezin agadol sheyandelem lisah chib to folgen the Chachamim. Rather, what it means is you have to accept their authority and you have to listen to what they have to say. On the Rambam is mazid dem nusach bracha. You can actually see the same kind of theme reflected in how the Rambam explains why the bracha for a mitzvah derabanan sounds like it's d'oraisa. That David instructed us to do this mitzvah. No, he didn't. The Chachamim made it up this mitzvah. By mitzvah derabanan. Says the Rambam, where does the Torah tell you that you have to read a Megillah or light a menorah? That you should say because the Torah tells us whatever they tell you, you have to do. So really what you're trying to illustrate in this bracha is that the David has sanctified us with these mitzvahs that the Eibush instructed us to listen to those people. And those people happen to tell us to light Hanukkah candles or read a Megillah. Or any other rabbinic mitzvah. In other words, maybe the answer is that maybe there isn't actually a list of rabbanim mitzvahs. Maybe it's just there's already an existing mitzvah. Listen to the Chachamim. There's already an existing mitzvah. Do not veer from what they said. You don't need another list of what they said. Beyond that, Mefarshim add another component. There is a whole argument to say, when the Torah tells you that food is treif, the item is treif. When the Chachamim tell you that you may not eat a particular thing, let's just say they did, it means you are restricted from eating it. It's like a nozer with wine. You know, the wine is not a problem. The nozer is not allowed to have the wine. In the So the Mefarshim want to say it's the same kind of concept. It's not that I have that like tefillin is a holy item. No, a menorah is not a holy item. I have an obligation to light a menorah. So maybe that's the reason why the Rambam did not give us a list and numbers of the mitzvah derabanan. Zayin mitzvah, whether he believes it's 7 like the majority of Mefarshim or not. Because the Rambam maybe wants to illustrate to us. First of all, each mitzvah derabanan is not seen as its own mitzvah, it's seen as part of a greater concept. It says, and therefore the name, the title mitzvah does not apply individually to every single instruction from the Chachamim. Because it's all part of one broader thing, which is follow the rabbis, don't move from what they say. Maybe you could say in a certain way it's similar to following a doctor. Obviously, a doctor is not a holy thing, and this is a holy thing. But the Torah tells us you have to listen to a doctor. Why do you have to follow the doctor? Because the Torah said you have to be protective of your own health. Nobody's going to tell you if you take the medication, that's one mitzvah. If you go for your checkup, that's another mitzvah. It's one mitzvah. Follow the doctor. One mitzvah. Follow the rabbis. So you're not to the you're following the rabbis. You're reading Megillah, you're following the rabbis. You can even take it further. Take, for example, kibbud avayim. It's a mitzvah d'oraisa, and there are many, many ways in which to do it. You don't get a unique mitzvah for every way you do it. It's one mitzvah, kibbud avayim. So maybe that's the reason. Says the Rebbe, it's not a good enough explanation. There are two key reasons why we can't do this, but first by way of introduction. The first thing is, it's very unlikely that the Rambam changed his approach with mitzvos derabanan from his approach right across 14 volumes of halacha. Everywhere else, he gets into the details and lists and gives us numbers. And over here, he doesn't. Only so he could hint, without even telling us, that that's because mitzvahs derabanan fall under one umbrella category. Surely this is a very important piece of information. The Rambam should have said it somewhere in his book. But besides that, is out of the etzem hanocha, as by the mitzvahs v'isum derabanan is l'das Rambam the mitzvah nit im meisen od dishmis divrei chachamim is tzorich iyon gadol. The truth is, to suggest that the Rambam believes that if I light a Hanukkah candle, it's not a mitzvah of lighting a Hanukkah candle, it's a mitzvah of listening to Chachamim, that needs a lot of attention and research and understanding. Especially when you consider that not all the Mefarshei Rambam understand that this is what the Rambam is saying. And it's nothing like the example of the doctor. Because when the doctor tells you something, nobody in their wildest dreams is going to suggest that the doctor is speaking Torah. But when the Chachamim say Eruv, that's part of Torah. Everybody recognizes it's part of Torah. And seeing as these are fundamental components of Torah Shabbal Peh, is moving. Think about it. If I'm doing a mitzvah because the Torah said so, that's because the Torah is Torah, therefore the mitzvah is a mitzvah. If I'm saying that this is Torah Shabbal Peh, then surely the things I have to do based on it should also be a mitzvah. It can't just be I'm doing it because there's another unrelated mitzvah. Listen to whatever they say. So therefore, it's much more likely that the Rambam believes that every mitzvah derabanan has some kind of mitzvah value. The question is, why doesn't he then give us that level of detail? But the second point is, even if you want to say that the Rambam wants us to know that mitzvahs derabanan fall under the category of lo yisasur or al pi haTorah sheyerucha, that's not what he's saying here. Here, that's not what the Rambam is emphasizing. Because you got to just follow this because it's a brilliant concept. Because the Rambam is about to talk about how come mitzvahs derabanan are not an addition to the Torah, which is forbidden by the Torah. Look what he says. If the Beis Din added something to Judaism as an injunction or as an instruction, they're not adding a mitzvah which is forbidden. Because the Chachamim are not saying, the Eibishter told us we have to read Megillah or make an Erev. Had they said that, they would be adding. They're saying, up until now there's 613 mitzvahs. We've now discovered that the Eibishter actually had another mitzvah as well. Rather, we have to say, the Nevi'im, or the Chachamim, as the case may be, they decided to introduce this element to Judaism, not as a mitzvah on the list of the 613, now 614. No, it's something else to either commemorate a particular thing, etc. Now, if we were going to say that mitzvahs derabanan are just part of an umbrella mitzvah to follow the Rabbanan, to follow the Chachamim, this would be a non-starter question. Der Rambam Gufa is doch madgish. Der mitzvos sagt nicht in mitzvah von mitzvos derabanan. Let's go with that thinking, right? The Rambam didn't list how many mitzvos derabanan they are. Why? Because he wanted us to know us mitzvos derabanan seien nicht zu teilt aus besondere mitzvahs. He wanted us to know that derabanan mitzvahs are not listed as independent mitzvahs. No, sie alle seien ein klolistische mitzvah deraisa. It's just one mitzvah which is already in the Torah. Folgen derabanan, like Tosim Ibrahim, follow rabbis and don't veer from what they said, which is in the Torah on the list of the 613. Sachmum bepashtas, as it's nitokin kosal kadaitach, as is zukikum al yisrael mitzvah mitzvah. Nobody would think if that's how the mitzvahs derabanan work that they're actually part of a mitzvah min Torah. Nobody would worry. Now you're adding more mitzvahs to the Torah. On a daf nit feinfen vi einam tesefes al mitzvahs Torah. The Rambam would not have to explain why Megillah is not an additional mitzvah. So it's not considered to the and not a contradiction to the prohibition of the Torah not to add additional mitzvahs. Therefore, you have no option but to agree to accept. As der von Guf, of was der Rambam darf doch gleich bewarnen, as ein und tesefes am mitzvahs Torah. The very fact that the Rambam had to explain to us that mitzvahs derabanan are not add-ons to the existing 613 mitzvahs is mochachas adrabah. That illustrates clearly to us, contrary to what we originally believed, that teichen dvar of dov and mitzvahs derabanan is as a zainen. Here, when he speaks about mitzvahs derabanan, he wants us to know that they are nit akim von ein mitzvahs Torah. They are not ways to fulfill an existing mitzvah in the Torah. Follow the rabbis. Shmias divrei chachamim. Nafaket noch mitzvahs. The Rambam is clearly telling us these are additional mitzvahs, but to mitzvahs Torah, which in some way are similar to the mitzvahs mandated by the Torah itself. Which we're obligated to fulfill, like we're obligated to fulfill mitzvahs in the Torah. And look at the language he uses. Besides the fact that it's very obvious, because now he's saying, how could you add mitzvahs? What if they weren't mitzvahs? You wouldn't be asking this question. Besides that, look at the language. He says there are other mitzvahs that were introduced after Matan Torah. He calls them mitzvahs. Then he continues. Each of these mitzvahs has all kinds of insights and all kinds of details. Again, he's calling them mitzvahs. And all of these mitzvahs that were introduced, we have to fulfill them. He's calling them mitzvahs. That means the Rambam believes they are independent mitzvahs. Not the details of an existing mitzvah daraisa. Follow the rabbis. They are in many ways like the existing 613 mitzvahs, except for the fact that they were introduced after Matan Torah and therefore introduced by Rabbanan. Which is why he immediately has to say, and now let me explain to you why this is not considered adding to the Torah, which is forbidden. If that's the case, we're back to our original question. Why does the Rambam not list a number for us? How many of these mitzvahs derabanan they are, considering the Rambam clearly believes that they are mitzvahs and not just part of an existing mitzvah? Shlomo Habir was that explanation is in them was the Rambam is madaik v'chizum when done the mitzvahs deraisa. Let's first start at the beginning. Why does the Rambam keep reiterating the number and the specifics of the mitzvahs deraisa? Saibit chilas dvarav. Firstly, at the introduction to the whole of Mishnah Torah and each section, these are the 613 mitzvahs. And then he has to go into the detail of how come it is that a mitzvah derabanan is not an addition to the mitzvah, and it has to be that the Navi doesn't claim that he was told by the Eibusha to add this now to the existing list of mitzvahs, or to delete a mitzvah from the 613. There you go. He's very clear that 613, 600 and no more and no less. It's a critical part of understanding how mitzvahs are. And on the other extreme, it doesn't say even anything about the number of the mitzvahs derabanan. In dem Guf verdrückt sich heißt im Chilik zwischen mitzvahs shel Torah und mitzvahs derabanan. The fact that mitzvahs deraisa have a number and mitzvahs derabanan do not have a number is not accidental or incidental. That describes the fundamental difference between mitzvahs deraisa and derabanan. The mitzvahs deraisa is eine b'minyan mitzvah mesuyim b'kovua. Mitzvahs deraisa, there is a number. The number is fixed. It will never change. The Torah tells us clearly you are not allowed to add a mitzvah. You're not allowed to detract a mitzvah. As the Rambam tells us, it's absolutely clear and explained, explicit. that the mitzvahs of the Torah are eternal, they'll never change, they'll never be, none will be deleted, none will be added. Because the pasuk tells us, the Torah tells us whatever the Eibusha told us, that's what we have to guard and that's what we have to do. Don't add to it, don't detract from it. Unlike mitzvos d'oraisa, which are given by the Eibusha in a fixed measure that can never change, mitzvos d'Rabbanan, by definition, is chatshu. They are things that were introduced later on in history. That the Rabbanan are empowered by the Torah to be able to add mitzvahs in order to keep the world in a healthy place. With the Rambam sagt in Hilchas Mamrim, again, as the Rambam goes in Hilchas Mamrim, which is all about people who rebel against this principle. That means that the idea of mitzvahs d'Rabbanan is not only different, it's the exact opposite of mitzvahs that have a fixed number, 613 mitzvahs. So the Rambam can't give a number to mitzvahs d'Rabbanan because it contradicts the purpose of mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. Kvius mispar is shaykh no by the mitzvahs d'Oraisa, need by mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. The idea of having a fixed number of mitzvahs can only apply to mitzvahs d'Oraisa because they can never change, and can never apply to mitzvahs d'Rabbanan because their whole point is that they changed, that they things that were added after. That's what it's all about, is adding. Let's understand this better. Noch mehr. Because the Chachamim actually have a responsibility to protect the Torah through various gezeros, etc. As the Rambam said, depending on the needs of the times, can doch sein, as so kommen Asher, wenn es fordert sich, zum Beispiel sein noch gezeros HaKolos Minhagos. The time may come where the Chachamim are going to have to enact new things that don't yet exist in Judaism. Mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. Und liegt auf der Chacham Achiv zum Moisef sein, und Achiv al Bnei Yisrael kaimen, und Achiv al Bnei Yisrael kaimen, die Yisofas Mitzad Yisofas Lishmoya. So they'll have the responsibility as the Chachamim, if the times require to introduce new halachas, and we'll have a responsibility to follow them, because the Torah says, Al Pi HaTorah, we have to follow whatever they say. Und auf Pi HaSapoil, can it nicht zukommen, can I mitzvahs d'Rabbanan before you panic? That can't really happen right now. Was ist nicht token Beis Nagod, was hat im Kerch zum Beispiel sein, because right now we do not have the Supreme Court in Yerushalayim who has the authority to do this. Shtei Tshuvas B'Davar, there are two factors that you have to consider. One more practical and one more ideological. Erstens, those by nitim get from mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. The fact that you cannot do something at a time does not change the definition of what that type of mitzvah is. Because the halacha allows the possibility of a Beis Din HaGadol introducing new mitzvahs, especially when Mashiach comes, when we will again have a Beis Din HaGadol, and the time will change completely, and who knows, maybe Yiddishkeit will look somewhat different. As or similar to how the Rambam explains in Sefer HaMitzvahs, in dem Tam was zwischen die Mitzvahs euch die Mitzvah von Hashmodas sein umes. So the Rambam says, why am I listing on the 613 mitzvahs a mitzvah that, since it's happened, can never happen again, to eradicate the 7 Canaanite nations? It happened at the time of Yeshua, that's it. Can't do it. It's not a mitzvah across the span of history. And the Rambam says, generally speaking, I don't include mitzvahs that are not applicable across history. Says the Rambam, the reason is not that the mitzvah doesn't exist today. It's because the mitzvah was achieved. And it's something which has a goal that has to be achieved. But the goal is not time specific, like get rid of the Canaanite nations. No time frame. You don't say it's not a mitzvah that applies through history. So that's why you have to be clear, the Rambam says, the difference between the mitzvah and what the mitzvah applies to. Because there are mitzvahs that technically apply across history, but the thing that the mitzvah applied to now no longer exists. The problem is not the mitzvah, the limitation is not the mitzvah, Problem is the circumstance. So in the same way, you could argue, in our scenario about mitzvahs derabanan, even though practically today we do not have the supreme Beis Din HaGadol sitting in Yerushalayim, so therefore nobody has this authority to make a new takana, a new mitzvah, etc. But the legal framework exists still today. The legal framework for a Beis Din HaGadol exists. And when a Beis Din HaGadol will exist, once again we'll be able to be Mechadash mitzvahs. So that's the first argument. Second argument, is and then there's an explanation that's even more pragmatic, which is there is scope for new mitzvahs derabanan even in the absence of a Beis Din HaGadol in Yerushalayim. How so? Well, the Rambam says this in his introduction to Sefer Hayyan, and when you think about it, it's like, oh, of course, we know this. Anything that was introduced in the Gemara Talmud Bavli, every Jew is required to follow. And every single city has to ensure that their populations follow the laws that were enacted by the Chachmei Gemara. Even though the Beis Din HaGadol in Yerushalayim disappeared long before the time of the Gemara. So the Rambam explains the reason is because those concepts that were introduced in the Gemara were accepted right across the whole Jewish world. And the people who made these laws were either the entire leadership of this Torah world, or at least its majority. And therefore the Rambam is saying that any minhag that is taken on by the entire Jewish community, it's as good as a mitzvah derabanan. Therefore, it's still possible to have mitzvah derabanan today. So the definition of mitzvah derabanan is they cannot be counted because there might be new ones still to come. Especially when you consider the Rambam says, that it's actually really simple, in theory, to re-establish the Beis Din HaGadol, because if all the Chachamim in Eretz Yisrael agree, and they make Dayanim, and they give them smicha, and take it from Beis Din HaGadol, then you could re-establish a Supreme Court in Eretz Yisrael. Und der Chiyuv Lishmoy mikol Beis Din HaGadol is nicht verbunden klar mit dem, was der Beis Din gefindt sich Rishkas HaGozis, and that Beis Din does not necessarily have to be in the physical location of Rishkas HaGozis. The Ramban disagrees with us, but let's leave the Ramban for now. That's what the Rambam says. So therefore, the Rambam's argument is the definition of mitzvahs derabanan is that they are designed to grow. Don't put a number on them. The mitzvahs d'oraisa are only 613. Therefore, dafka specify the numbers. Now, now, the reality is, as we mentioned earlier, most Sfarim identify 7 mitzvahs that are called the mitzvahs derabanan. The mitzvah zayin is beduk v'dafka, and it's very specifically chosen, as we'll see in a second. Or kiyodua, as in zayin mitzvah derabanan, b'yachem mititag mitzvahs deraisa is the mitzvah beduk tov reishchav. Because we know if you take the 613 mitzvahs and you add the 7 derabanan, you get 620, which is keser Torah, the crown of Torah. That's why you find Aseret HaDibros has 620 letters. As the Shalom points out, that the 613 letters of the Aseret HaDibros correspond to the 630 mitzvahs d'oraisa, and the 7 additional letters, they represent the mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. It's just klal consternit lanal. Now we've just given a whole argument that there's not supposed to be a number to the mitzvahs d'Rabbanan, and now everybody's saying 7, and it's very specific, and we calculate it to get to keser or tarach, etc. Why? Well, in these svarim retzich vidos is befeil, because these svarim are all talking about how things are in practice. That there are zayin mitzvahs d'Rabbanan, and possibly kol gamli asid lavim. Maybe even when Mashiach comes, it will still remain only zayin mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. Was Melmaili is ausgestellt as es werden befehl nicht sein mehr wie mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. The Eibishter decided that even though the concept of mitzvahs d'Rabbanan is to innovate, the practicality is that there'll be 7 mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. The best in welcher ken mechadish and Moses sein wird mitzvahs nicht mechadish sein befehl. So even when we have a Beis Din HaGadol one day in Yerushalayim, they won't actually add new mitzvahs. Und zusammen mit den mitzvos deraisa sein in zeterach mitzvos keser, and that's going to create this beautiful combination of the mitzvos deraisa, which are 613, and derabanan, which are 7, to get us keser. Aber mitzad dem geder from mitzvos derabanan al pi halacha, that's what happens in practice. But the Rambam is telling us how mitzvos derabanan work legally. Legally, there's scope for more mitzvahs. And if we should add more mitzvahs, they'll be just as binding as these mitzvahs derabanan. Let's look at this in different words just for clarity. The fact that the Eibishter knows that in practice there'll only ever be 7 mitzvahs derabanan. That doesn't change the fact that halacha allows the possibility of more mitzvahs derabanan. Especially when you consider free choice is a part of the human experience. And that includes that we can even do things which are contrary to the Torah. Can very nice the best in dar from even though that there's only 7 mitzvahs derabanan, humans have free choice. Based on their free choice, humans could choose to do something that will require the basin to be mechadesh a mitzvah, which wasn't even part of the original 7. Mind-boggling concept. And if you can't wrap your head around that, which most of us can't, how's it possible that the Eibishter knows there's only going to be 7 mitzvahs derabanan? But then there's the possibility of free choice, and based on the free choice, the Beis Din might have to make a new mitzvah. Well, that's the broader concept of Bechira that the Rambam talks about, Bechira, and how the Eibishter knows what's happening. The fact that the Eibishter knows everything is not Bechira Sodom. That doesn't steal our free choice. Human choices are human choices. The Eibishter gave every person permission. If the person wants to veer to the side of righteousness and become a tzaddik, great, the Eibishter will facilitate. But he also allows the alternative. Where the Rambam is Mevoid Barucha, as the Rambam explains in great detail, and tells us that it's something beyond the scope of our understanding. The point that's relevant for us is the nature of mitzvahs derabanan is to increase the number, therefore it's not appropriate to give them a number. Now that we understand that the Rambam is telling us the reason I'm not giving you a number of how many mitzvahs derabanan there are is because I'm a sefer halacha, and the legal definition of mitzvahs derabanan is that there should be scope for more of them, so it makes no sense to give them a number. On the head, is api halachas teras emes. And by the way, the fact that mitzvahs derabanan are not limited to a number is something that Torah made. Shleimar as das is matin damit was is mevur in Sfarim from Gedolei Yisrael, that fits perfectly with what Chachamim Gedolei Yisrael teach. At the misma medug for mitzvahs derabanan is mashlim the mitzvah tar for Eichchav keser, as we already mentioned. You take the Zayin mitzvah derabanan, add them to the 613 mitzvahs deraisa, and you get keser. Why is that linked? So in halacha we find 2 things. On the one hand, halacha is considered the crown of the Torah. And halachas have no specific number. Like it says, based on the pasuk in Shir, that there were maidens without number. So what are these alamas we're talking about? No, you should read it as oilamos. There are worlds and worlds of halacha that have no number. The fact that halachas have no number is associated with the idea that halachas are keser. Because the halachas of the Torah are linked to this concept of keser, that's why they're beyond number. But dogma via keser gashmi was the mighty minoroish and his makiftem roish was dos vais as hecha from dimension. In the same way as a crown, a keser sits on top of the person's head, implying that this is something which is greater than the whole person. So in the same way, this is the part of Torah that is greater than being limited to a specific kind, a specific number. And yet at the same time, as I guess I meet it, but at the same time, the crown has to fit the head. So in spiritual terms, we're talking about keser, which is such an elevated level of holiness, but it also is the keser of lower realities and lower worlds as well. And the halachas was that's why halachas, which are very pragmatic, they talk about our world. So they're like the crown that fits the head, and yet they're above the head, unlimited in number. And a very similar thing applies to the mitzvahs derabanan. Obviously, mitzvahs derabanan have a much closer, in a sense, relationship to Torah Shabbat Peh than regular halachas. Because halachas are mevorim for Torah Shabbat. The purpose of halachas is to say, okay, here's Shabbos, that's in Torah Shabbat. All the halachas have Shabbos, 39 melachas, this is how they manifest, etc. But mitzvahs derabanan, those are, so to speak, new mitzvahs that were introduced. That is much more like Torah Shabbat Peh, the koyach of us to extrapolate out of Torah and to create out of Torah. And that's because the mitzvahs derabanan are linked to keser, which is higher than the system. High even than the chokhmah, so to speak, of Torah, which is in Torah Shabbat. And therefore translates into something which has no measure. What does it mean has no measure? Theoretically, conceptually, halachically, you could consistently add more mitzvahs derabanan. Even though practically, once you're in our world, there is a limitation to how many halachas you could have. And mitzvahs derabanan actually turn out to be limited to just 7. That's how it's manifested in our world. But how it exists in the world of halacha, of a made of a sefer Rambam, shehu halachas, like for example the Rambam sefer, which is all about halacha, kommt zu achidish godel l'shen Rambam matzman kenal reishimich beis, reishsiv beis, as is an oile und alofim rabim befoyal lemailem im did v'agbola berach hamitzvah desheva. The truth is that they expand into thousands of mitzvahs, thousands of halachas that you can't even give the number. That's how it is in concept in halacha. And when we learn the halachas of Torah, which are considered the crown of the Torah, is, as we say every day in our davening, any person who revises or reviews Torah, halacha, every single day, such a person has a chelik in olam haba, and we should be zocher to see the olam haba of the time, the more advanced phase of Mashiach, which is the ultimate olam haba, and that should happen, take it from Yad Mamish.